everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're gonna dye a yarn lasagna. This is a technique where I layer yarn and dye with more yarn and more dye and more yarn and more dye all in a pan, and can be a very convenient way to get good coverage for a variegated colorway, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But the plan is to go back to the original lasagna roots, where I'm going to be dyeing the same colorway on every single layer on the yarn versus mixing it up like I've done a few times recently. Before we go and talk about the yarn we're going to be using today, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Kara. Kara, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I'm really excited to dye your luxurious yarn, and we have a really fun color palette for you too. Speaking of the yarn, let's go take a look. Today in our yarn lasagna, we're going to layer two different types of yarn. The primary yarn we're going to dye today is Wool to Dye For's 50/50 Silk Sock. This yarn is 50% superwash merino, 50% silk. It has an incredible drape and shine that you can see even right here. The other yarn we're going to dye is also superwash merino based, but this is Knit Pick Stroll. It is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And I would say color-wise, it feels a little bit more off-white, slightly more yellow than our silk blend, at least at this point. Part of that could also be the little bit of a shine from the silk. Now, historically, Stroll will absorb a little bit more dye than, say, Wool to Dye For's Platinum, which has the same fiber content, the same percentage blend. But this has a totally different type of fiber content. Silk absorbs color slower, and even if they absorb the same amount of color, the exact same amount of color, the colors might feel very similar when wet, but I expect we'll see a pretty big difference between the two once the yarn is dry. Just because silk, in order for hand-dyed silk to feel as pigmented as a non-silk blend, you need to add more pigment to it. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pre-soak all of the yarn I want to dye. 400 grams of our silk blend, 300 grams of the stroll, 200 for the lasagna, 1 for a yarn mop. I'm going to pre-soak everything in plain tap water with no acid overnight. The no acid part is pretty important, mainly because we want to be able to spread our colors through the yarn with our lasagna. My lab partner Kara actually suggested some colors for our project today. So I pulled my Dharma acid dyes in hyacinth, delphinium blue, silver gray, and Caribbean blue. Now with the little swatches that I have up here, the Caribbean blue looks like it's going to be way brighter than the rest. Hyacinth actually has a bit of a brightness to it, but can be a little tricky when we're starting cold with no acid, which we'll address as we get there for that particular color, because it will show up today. But if I pull up some swatches of, say, my purple dyes, that hyacinth really is more of a bright, like blue violet kind of color. I absolutely adore it, and I think if I'm light-handed with the Caribbean blue but heavier-handed with the hyacinth, we could have a winner here. Now, instead of the Caribbean blue, I could go ahead and use frozen blue, which looks more muted, you know, if I'm just looking at the poster swatches I have on my dye containers up here. But frozen blue is less pigmented. However, with the dry powder, frozen is very similar to Caribbean blue in terms of tone. So I may go that way just so that way I'm not too heavy-handed with the Caribbean blue. The lasagna today is only going to have 3 layers in it. Each layer will have 200 grams of yarn. 2 of them will be that luxurious silk blend, and then the top layer will be our stroll. Off to one side, I have another skein of stroll that is our yarn mop for today. Whenever I have dye on my gloves, whether it is dry dye powder or liquid dyes from working colors through, I will wipe it onto the skein. Now, there's no acid in here, just like there's no acid in here yet. I will need to add vinegar to everything in the end. Now, the first thing I need to do is just spread out our yarn. And if I am good and don't add too much water for this first layer, I can flip it over. Now, the whole reason that I started doing this lasagna-y technique is that sometimes when I want to get variegated yarn where I have the colors go all the way through really easily, I like to set things up cold with no acid. And on this first layer, I'm gonna add some water because we need some liquid in here to move things through, but maybe I added 5 cups. That was maybe a little more than I wanted. I could remove some, but I think I'm gonna just go with it. And it should be fine. Now, I will be adding dry powder onto the yarn and then working it through using the water in the local areas to distribute that through. As I add more dye and more yarn and work those colors through in each layer, I'm continuing to work them through here on the bottom layer. So if I do it correctly, we should end up with little to no white left behind. The one caveat here is that occasionally there is a color or a pigment that even with no acid could start striking to the yarn really quickly, and then we will get something more speckly and broken versus getting coverage. Now, of the colors we have here, the delphinium blue does break. We'll see how it's behaving as we add it, but the plan is to treat all of the layers the same. And so now I'm gonna go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we can start applying our colors. I am going to start with the hyacinth because you'll see when I mentioned that this is a trickier color. And I'm going on not incredibly light, but also not incredibly heavy. But you can see that this color looks pigmented, right? But now as I go and start working it through, I'm glad I can see some residue of it, but it almost disappears, right? It looks like it is an extraordinarily pastel color. Now, the reason for putting this one on first is that over time, the color will reappear. Something about when it first dissolves cold with no acid makes it look less saturated than it really is. And so it's a color that is easy to add way too much of. Not that I would mind having a ton of it, but slowly we see more and more of it. Okay, the frozen blue, I'm gonna come in and add this down here. But see how bright this is looking? Yeah, I'm really glad I went for this instead of the Caribbean blue, just because I feel like if I did the Caribbean blue, I would have added conceivably way too much, and it wouldn't have been bad per se, but it would have made the color extraordinarily saturated. Now, we're getting decent coverage so far, as I accidentally moved some of this color down. That is fine. You can see we can kind of blend it out. But the hyacinth, there is some all the way through a bit. But as we work the colors in, we're going to be adding more and more and more color. Not that we're getting something incredibly saturated today. As I bring in our delphinium blue, which actually, this is a color, this is something I almost forgot. This is a color that looks very different when you start cold versus hot. And that's because of the way that the pigments break. So right here, right now it is looking way more pink than the hyacinth, which is fine. And we might see some breaking from it. I will probably add some more of it on, but it's just funny that I always expect it to be a little bit bluer than what it actually is. Now, the big key of everything is I do want my gloved fingertips to be dry before I go into the dye powder,
just because I don't want to introduce moisture into these stock solutions. Okay, the silver gray, ooh, which is looking a little intense right now, which is fine. I feel like this silver gray and sand dune are two colors that, now I'm having a wondering, but I feel like they're two colors that sometimes look way darker at some points than others. But the thing that just occurred to me is I had an issue where I realized that navy with a lot of heat gets lighter and lighter, and I wonder, could silver gray be doing that as well? I mean, I don't think so, and I don't have a situation right off the top of my head where I observed that, but I really don't know. I'm going to go in with some more hyacinth, and actually, using my other hand, I did a little bit too much there, some delphinium blue. Now typically, I try to close containers when they are not being used, but I did not entirely do that this time because I did not want to introduce some of the wrong powder into that delphinium blue. I am really glad I went for the frozen. I like the pop of color, but I'm glad it isn't too bright. I'm also really happy that I have the order sort of this way. I'm really liking this color palette and progression. Okay, now the one thing I do want to do is, and this is something that I don't always do, but I'm trying to flip the yarn over. We will be adding more color and dye on each layer, but, ooh, and I see some breaking. I see some more pink there. We are going to get some breaking from that delphinium blue, but this can just help us work these colors through. And I think because we have some pre-mixed pastels, also maybe they aren't going to go all the way through on their own. So let me quickly add a little bit more of each of these colors and work them through. I am ready for the next layer now. But what I am going to do is add a little bit of powder from each of the colors and not work it through before I bring on the next layer. This will allow me to get some pigment on the underside of the next yarn while also continuing to work the colors through the layer that we already have. Okay, the powders are on. Let's bring over our second layer. Now, the yarns that I'm bringing over do have some moisture in them. And there might be some more like variegated patches as things are sort of, you know, like layered over and scrunched. But now that I have the yarn on, I can come and start working the colors through. And hopefully not, you can see the blue splashed a little bit. That is fine. But even with no acid, the colors we have here in our yarn are way more pastel than what we had on that first layer. But as we saw before, even when we flipped things over, we still got some non-white coverage on our yarn. So I'm very confident we're going to get a similar color here without needing to flip things over. And if I flip it, the color on the bottom is actually darker than the color on the top. Now at this stage, I'm bringing over more water. We still do not have any acid in here, and I think I'm going to want a little bit more water than this, just so that way I can work things through. All right, I'm going to add just a tiny bit more water. We want enough water in here that I can work things through multiple layers and the yarn isn't too compressed, but not so much water that the colors are gonna move and blend a ton. But now I'm gonna go ahead and do exactly what I did with that first layer.
As I add on these powdered dyes and work them through, what is the point of doing this technique? Why not just have 2 different pans or have all 400 grams in one layer? Well, by having only 200 grams of yarn in the pan at a time, this allows me to spread the yarn out more. If I had 4 skeins side by side, the layers of yarn would be thicker, and so it would be harder to get that pigment all the way to the center of the skeins. And as you saw when I added the layer on top of the dye powder, it's not as dark as that first layer until I build up and add more color. Now, as for why I don't go ahead and to dye 6 skeins of yarn in this colorway, why don't I go ahead and use 3 different pans, each with 200 grams? You can totally do that. However, I don't have the stove space to fit all that. And I have one of my other pans is busy with another project in another colorway. And so this is just allowing me to fit more yarn in one pan than normally I would do. As a small batch dyer with limited heating elements, this works well for me. If there's a dyer who has a much bigger capacity and they have proofing cabinets or a ton of different warmers, this is not a technique that would make sense for them because they have a lot of pans and can therefore spread it out. But it started as silly fun, but also just worked to help me get the coverage I wanted, and so therefore I like the technique. Once I was satisfied with this color coverage on our last silk layer, I added more powder of the 4 different colors and then brought over the stroll fingering weight yarn. Now we're switching the fiber content, and I don't expect things to look very different at this point. I think that they will look different near the end. The one thing I don't know is if, like in between the stroll and the silky yarn, if we'll end up seeing the stroll absorb more color. Those are all questions that I do have, but I added more water to everything before adding on the powders and working the colors through, again, until I was satisfied with the color coverage. And now we have our lasagna almost ready to go, but we need to add acid still. I am feeling very satisfied with our color coverage. There's a lot of dye in the water. What's funny is that if I go underneath with the delphinium blue, it's looking way more blue and less pink. I have a feeling that that also, I know that that's a color that is a little bit sensitive per se. And see, the hyacinth has also developed more as time has gone on, I think. The delphinium blue is a color that can look very different if you start cold versus if you start hot. Say the delphinium blue and twilight gray are the 2 biggest offenders of that. But anyway, we do need to add acid. These are acid dyes, so we need acidic conditions for them to bind, or at least more acidic than what we have here already. Oh, and here's our yarn mop so far. But I think I want to let everything sit for a little bit. Just because since things seem to be happening and colors seem to be shifting, especially in this middle area, I think I'm going to set a timer for 20 minutes and just let everything sit. I'm not going to move it. I'm not going to move the camera. And then we'll come back and then finally add our acid. I just want to point out that even after 15 minutes, I feel like this is looking more blue and less pink than it did before. Maybe I should have separated the delphinium blue and the hyacinth, but because of the way like the ends are doubled over, it's going to kind of give a third, a third, a third of each of the colors, even though we will have differences within here. But there's still 6 minutes on the timer. I don't think I pointed it out a ton during the video, the way that the hyacinth deepened, but I guess we did just show that the delphinium blue deepened. Okay, let's add 1, 2, 3, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar along the top. And what I could see, at least on the frozen, we still have a lot of dye in here. Not as much on the silver gray. A lot of that has struck already. There's a lot of pigment in here in the middle with the purples as we try to work the acid through a bit. But I know that I added less than 16 cups of water so far. I will probably add a little bit more water in a moment as we go to heat it. But yeah, there's still a fair amount of color down there. Now we have seen some of the color kind of stays put really right where we've placed it. Other colors will move around a little bit more. It's just interesting to see. All right, in this container that has 3 cups of water, I just added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. So this is gonna bring us up to, as I pour a little bit on, and then we're gonna fluff up the yarn. I don't want things so compressed because I don't want to risk burning anything. Not that I'm actually concerned about anything burning, but I'm gonna add the rest. So now we have a total of 16 cups of water and 6 tablespoons of white vinegar, and we have enough liquid and things in here that we can move this acid through. And so now I'm gonna take everything over to the stove to start heating it up. I need to recharge my microwave light, so things look a little dark right now. I just turned the heat on to medium. We are on top of 2 gas burners here and here. And I'm setting my first timer for 15 minutes as we're heating it up. I'm gonna want things to have about 30 minutes of heat, but I also wanna make sure I come back and check, and I'll check on things a couple times within those first 15 minutes. And I'll see about replacing my light. I use these magnetic, just rechargeable lights. And I have 2. There we go, now I have the other one on. There's 2 for exactly this reason. The difference here between the delphinium blue and the hyacinth is so subtle. I do see more pink elements that are in here. I'm excited to see how this may break. But yeah, we'll check back in when it's time. And as for the yarn mop, either I will steam set this eventually, I do need to add acid to it, or I think I may, once I remove all this yarn, add it to this dye bath to heat set that way. So we'll see. I've moved the camera, but oh my gosh, intensity. I feel like when we were last here, we saw like these colors felt a little bit more muted. And the delphinium blue, which was right here, and the hyacinth have nearly cleared, as with our silver and our frozen. I'm sure if I pull over, there will be a little bit of pigment in there, but what I'm gonna do from here is I am going to reduce the heat to low, and we are gonna go ahead and set a timer for 30 minutes. Since we're basically at temp, we're gonna heat for 30 minutes, and then we can remove all of this yarn. I do see a lighter patch here. Ah, bummer. Not the end of the world or anything, but the goal is to try to get even coverage. But clearly I missed something in the corner, which we could go back and add more color, but I don't want to. I don't want to. And I want to see like the faults of the technique, right? But anyway, I'll see you in 30 minutes. I feel like I've been really good with the temperature today as I turn off the heat. Sometimes, like the ideal temp for dyeing yarn is just below a boil. So steam is good, but we don't need a lot of movement. I could use a thermometer, but I also don't want to. All right, let's go ahead and start removing our layers. Okay, and right away with the blue feels a little more pigmented on the stroll right off the bat. But as I mentioned, the colors in the end are going to feel way more pigmented on the stroll than they will on the silk yarn, just because of the fact that silk requires more dye to have the same coloration. But when it's wet, I think that the silk fibers get a bit translucent. Well, my coverage of the gray was a little bit patchy there. The gray did seem to strike faster than the other colors with low acid though. But I think that the colors will feel darker now because those silk fibers are a bit translucent.
And right now when wet, the difference between the silk, which is up here by my thumb, and the stroll, which is down here, those differences are very minor. I think those differences are gonna feel more extreme once everything dries. There's a hint of color left in. Ooh, I see some breaking in our delphinium blue section. Yeah, I'd say a little bit more tonal variation than sometimes I see, but also I need to remind myself I was going for more medium saturated colors versus extremely saturated colors. I'm bringing our yarn mop over now, and this is going to soften some of the colors in here, but also they should mostly stay put from where they were placed, just because that's the experience I have. I will turn the heat back on, and I'm going to heat this for 30 minutes. I feel like these colors bloomed a little bit too. Not super hot, but a nice subtle yarn mop. If I had steam set it, there would probably be more white on it. But this guy I'm gonna let cool. We'll wash off camera. The rest of the yarn, once it's cool, well, now we'll go wash it. We are gonna wash all of our cooled off yarn. Yes, I was a good girl. I let everything cool completely. Hot waters can make acid dyes bleed, so I recommend washing your hand-dyed yarns in cold water. But the good news is that nothing's coming out. I'm gonna add a little bit of dish soap. I don't usually wash 6 skeins of yarn at once, but today I figured we may as well. Now, just like I noted before, on the blue end, our silk blend, and yes, it's shiny, you can see the shine even here. The color is lighter, but you're seeing the shine, so it's not quite as light there. It's similar for now. But even any micro differences, there aren't like huge, extreme differences yet. I imagine we'll see more once we remove more liquid. Maybe I'll go ahead and show you the yarn out of the spin dryer. I'm going to rinse it one more time to get out the soap. But what my spin dryer is, it's basically a spray spinning device that has like the spin cycle of the washing machine. So it'll spin out a bunch of the extra liquid. It doesn't leave the yarn dry, it leaves it damp, but damp with most of the water removed. And it allows the yarn to dry nice and fluffy because the water isn't weighing it down as you hang it to dry. Okay, we have a silk in between, 2 others, and then 3 silks. If I had more of this yarn, I might have done the lasagna of all one thing. But it is fun to see that at least initially the coloration is similar. Fresh from the spin dryer, you can see the silk closest to my fingers is lighter. Not significantly. And in fact, on the stroll, the silver looks darker on the silk on that one. So we'll see when it dries. But in general, silk blends end up looking lighter, and you can really see that in the blue. This came out so pretty, and you absolutely can tell the difference in here between our hyacinth and the delphinium blue. The delphinium blue absolutely feels more blue, the hyacinth more hyacinth purple. They're very subtly different though. The one thing I didn't keep track of were which skeins were on the bottom together. You know, so I don't know if, say, the bottom 2 were one batch and the top 2 were another. That I didn't keep track of. But what we do know is that these 2 skeins are our stroll, and the colors are overall more pigmented. I feel like the biggest differences come from the blue and like the hyacinth. The difference is subtle, but there's definitely more saturation in the stroll. Now, is it because the yarn absorbed more color? I don't really think so. I think that it has to do with just the silk content. The silky yarns absorb color really fast as well. So it's hard to say, but I'm really glad that I used both of these fiber blends for our lasagna. And isolated like this, I think you can feel, the grays feel more similar, but yeah, you can see the saturation difference for sure. Now, speaking of subtle, our yarn mop is extraordinarily subtle. There are a few hints of the darker gray, but mostly we have a soft blue with some pops of purple and blue. And I love it. Kara, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you love the way this yarn turned out and had fun seeing the original type of lasagna that I would do for dyeing yarn. If you would like to learn more about how you can be a lab partner like Kara, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There's 2 ways you can sign up. You can pick a yarn base, tell me some colors to avoid, and then I will dye some yarn with you in mind. Or you can pick from a list of videos that I've already started filming and see details about the colors and the techniques. And then I will film last minute shout outs to include for you in the video. If you have any questions about being a lab partner, feel free to reach out to me on Etsy to chat about that more. But Kara, thank you again, and I hope you're gonna love your yarn. The technique of starting cold and adding the dye powders onto the yarn to create something variegated, starting cold with no acid, allows me to get better coverage, even though we had some lighter patches in here. Overall, it allows me to get more coverage and more even color than applying liquid dyes onto the yarn lets me do. And I think that that's because when I am dissolving the dyes on the yarn itself, I am working it through multiple layers before it has a chance to strike. When I'm applying liquid dye onto the yarn, then there are times when I find myself needing to add more and more liquid to try to get that color even, and you can get some patchiness or modeling from the technique of hand painting with the liquid dyes. And then if I'm doing low immersion with liquid dyes, I've also found that I need to flip the yarn so many times. And so this technique with dry powder on the yarn, with or without a lasagna, works really, really well for me. What the lasagna aspect adds is that I'm just massaging all of the yarn that much more. And so that also helps me even out the color and get the coverage, because I am not just dyeing the yarn and moving on to the next pan. Each layer I'm working things through, and so I think that that helps. But you can let me know what you think about this technique down in the comments below. And while you're at it, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. You know what I'm not seeing as we take this final close look? I feel like I saw a lot more breaking from the delphinium blue before the yarn dried. Maybe it's there and I'm just missing it as I'm starting to film these conclusions, but I know that it can exist and can be there. I think that from far away, I'm just not seeing it right now. Which doesn't mean the yarn's not beautiful. It's still very, very beautiful. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.